Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into the absolute ultimate mystery of human choice and human destiny. We're going to explore this truly fascinating intersection where modern neuroscience meets ancient theology. So we'll be unpacking some pretty profound questions about who is actually in the driver's seat of your life, pulling incredible insights from both cutting-edge scientific studies and 1400-year-old texts.
To kick things off, I want you to picture a perfectly ordinary morning. You wake up, you stroll into the kitchen, and you make a really simple, everyday choice. Tea or coffee? Let's just say you decide to go with a cup of tea. It feels like a minor decision, right? Completely, entirely your own. But what if I told you that a laboratory machine could potentially prove your brain actually made that choice before you even realized you were making it? What if that decision was already written down somewhere in your neural pathways before your conscious mind even caught up to the fact?
Section 1. The illusion of choice. Okay, let's investigate this scientific crime scene. We really have to travel back to the 1980s for this, which was a time when the whole concept of free will suddenly became a prime suspect and a potential victim of neuroscience. A scientist named Benjamin Libet asked a totally wild question. Does a decision happen in our conscious mind first or in our physical brain first? So he hooked subjects up to sensors to track their brain waves and gave them a super simple instruction. Just flick your wrist whenever you feel like it. No rules, just do it whenever. Well, he discovered a startling sequence. First, the brain fires a signal, what they call a readiness potential. Then, about half a second later, the person actually feels like they consciously made the choice. And then finally, the wrist physically moves. The brain literally sprang into action before the person even knew they wanted to move.
It genuinely seemed like the brain was writing the script and the person was just reading it out loud. And the plot actually thickens, because by 2008, scientists were using these highly advanced fMRI scans, and they realized they could predict simple choices up to a staggering 7 seconds before the person was consciously aware of them. I mean, really think about that for a second. 7 whole seconds before you think you've made a decision, a glimpse of it already exists in your brain.
Section 2. Loopholes in the science.
As you can probably guess, when this data came out, a lot of prominent scientists and philosophers just panicked. They started declaring that free will is a total illusion, a complete lie, and that we're essentially just biological machines acting out pre-written code. But when we look a little more closely at these experiments, 3 massive loopholes start to appear. First off, the decisions in the lab were completely meaningless reflexes. Flicking a wrist? That has no moral weight, no real purpose, no deep thought behind it. In fact, more recent studies in 2019 showed that when humans make real, meaningful decisions, that early predictive brain signal basically just vanishes. Second, that 7-second prediction accuracy? It was only about 60%. I mean, if I flip a coin, I have a 50% chance of guessing right. A 60% accuracy is more like reading a weather forecast. It's a tendency, a lean. It is definitely not a pre-written destiny. And third, and honestly most importantly, subjects retained what is known as veto power.
Even Benjamin Libet himself pointed this incredible phenomenon out. He noted that while the brain might start the engine and suggest an action, you possess this incredibly powerful ability to hit the brakes. He called it the veto, or free won't. That means even if a subconscious urge bubbles up in your physical brain, the final authority to approve or overrule that proposal lies entirely with your conscious self.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that in all these experiments, science was strictly measuring the physical brain. And what is the brain really? The source material highlights that the brain is essentially just a biological processor. It's a database. Every single memory, every trauma, every experience you've ever had is stored right there. It recognizes patterns based entirely on past data. It doesn't have a single byte of data from the future. When you're faced with the unknown, the brain just falls back on past patterns, triggering reflexes like fight, flight, or freeze. It's a machine built out of the past, not the actual conscious chooser facing the future.
Section 3. The brain and the heart.
Now, if the physical brain in our skulls is just this machine running on past data, what is actually making those final conscious choices when we step into the unknown? Well, to explore this, the source material cross-references this modern scientific dilemma with 1400-year-old Islamic theology. When the Qur'an discusses deep understanding, decision-making, and spiritual blindness, it surprisingly doesn't tell people to think with their brains. Instead, it repeatedly states that true understanding resides in the heart. The verses explicitly mention that people have hearts with which they do not understand, and they clarify that true blindness isn't of the eyes, but of the hearts in their chests. It actually gives a physical address, suggesting this isn't just some poetic metaphor.
For centuries, that might have sounded purely poetic.
But fast forward to 1991, and a scientist at the University of Montreal, Dr. J. Andrew Armour, completely shocked the medical world. He discovered that the heart actually has its own robust, incredibly complex nervous system. He literally coined the term, the little brain in the heart. It has its own sensory neurons, its own motor neurons, its own inner neurons. It can process information, it can remember patterns, and most astonishingly of all, it can make decisions completely independent of the brain in your head.
And here's a totally fascinating biological twist. We've always just assumed the brain is the undisputed CEO of the body, right? Just shouting orders down to everything else. But research shows the traffic is heavily skewed the other way. The heart actually sends significantly more commands upwards to the brain than the brain sends downwards to the heart. The source material even points out this wild fact. In the womb, a baby's heart begins to beat and function before the brain is even fully formed.
Section 4. Two dangerous extremes.
So how exactly does this biological revelation of the heart's independent processing power help bridge the gap between scientific determinism, the idea that our brains predecide everything, and the theological concept of human destiny? The source explains that for centuries, human philosophy has been basically trapped between two extremes, two cliffs you can really easily fall off. On one side you have determinism, the belief that absolutely everything is pre-written, rendering us all just helpless puppets, and that leads to profound apathy, like why work hard, why try to be a good person if the script is already finalized? On the other side is absolute independence, the belief that there's no overarching plan whatsoever, and we are entirely the masters of our own universe, and that leads to extreme arrogance, essentially the illusion that we are our own gods.
Section 5. Knowledge is not compulsion. To resolve this huge philosophical tug-of-war, the source details how Islamic theology introduces what we can call a third path. It's a framework intended to perfectly balance the belief in divine destiny with absolute, undeniable human responsibility. The absolute key to understanding destiny on this path is recognizing the massive difference between two specific concepts: knowledge and compulsion. Knowledge is simply knowing what will happen in the future. Compulsion is actively, physically forcing that thing to happen. They are definitely not the same thing, even though we so often confuse them.
Let's look at this fantastic analogy of a teacher provided in the text. Think of a highly observant, brilliant teacher who is perfectly prepared and honest, hardworking student. Now, when that student goes into an exam, the teacher knows, with absolute 100% certainty, that the student isn't going to cheat. When the student sits down and takes the test fairly, did the teacher's advanced knowledge somehow force the student to be honest? Not at all. The teacher's knowledge was totally accurate, yes, but the student still freely, independently chose honesty.
According to the source, this brilliantly illustrates the theological concept of destiny. God is seen as existing outside of time, seeing the past, the present, and the future all at once. God knows perfectly what your choices will be, meaning your destiny is written because you will freely choose it. You don't choose it simply because it was written. The sequence is just completely reversed from how our time-bound human minds normally try to think about it. Because you have that ultimate veto power, that true independent choice which is perhaps seated right there in the intelligence of the heart, the ultimate responsibility always rests with you. This is exactly why the source material emphasizes this quote from the Qur'an: humans are shown the path, the reality is laid out right before them, but they possess the absolute freedom to be either grateful or ungrateful. There's no contradiction here at all. The path is known, but the choice of exactly how to walk it is entirely yours.
As we wrap up this explainer, we've journeyed all the way from those wrist-flicking experiments of the 1980s down through the incredible neural pathways of the heart, all the way to ancient theological wisdom. Remember that the next time you face a choice, whether it's as small as tea or coffee, or as massive as the entire direction of your life, the moment itself may have been known for all of eternity, but the choice is entirely, completely, 100% yours. So, equipped with all this new knowledge, what are you going to choose next?